Good morning. Today is the 20th day of Kislev, the 11th of December. We're continuing. We spoke last time about this question about how usually when you go from one partsuf to the lower, then the influence is through the nehi, through the habitual sfirot. And here we see that there's somehow an influence directly from the mind. We spent a lot of time talking about that, why that's usually not the case, but in this case it is. So he explained here that the reason here is that it can go directly from the mind to nukva, from the mind of Za, of Zer and Pin, directly to the nukva, to the feminine persona, is because these are hairs, and hair follicles, they can skip over levels. That's their whole point. So here in this case, the skipping is over, it goes directly from the mind, it skips over the chabad, and it goes down to the nehi, as it were. In any case, we at the end of last time, we gave an explanation, one explanation, which is that the nukva represents speech in general. When you say nukva, the persona of nukva is the persona that the person has when he speaks. By the way, this means that speech is a different persona in the person. It also means that the way I talk is not necessarily who I am, because it's a different persona altogether. It's like I have a certain persona when I speak. There's people who are excellent speakers, but they're a completely different person in terms of who they really are. It's almost like an act, but it's not an act. It's just a different persona. So because it's a different persona, it has influence, almost its own mind. It's like its own different mind entirely. I was speaking about this with my son yesterday. He went on Mivtzaim.
What?
On Mivtzaim, he went to...
Yeah.
I don't know why the Mivtzah in Chanukah is to give out sufganiyot, but the Mivtzah really is to light candles. But if they go during the day, that's all they do, and they speak to people. So he's been going to army bases. So somebody asked him a delicate question, and he started giving a whole long explanation. And I told him that's not how you handle these questions, because you don't want to give long and elaborate explanations to someone you don't know. Why? Because in general, they're not a vessel for it. They won't understand it. It takes time to build up. He's a yeshiva kid, so he's still... he's tamim. He's still naive. He doesn't know. And then you can get into all these arguments, and in the end, it doesn't come out well. You have to give the simplest answer that will suffice. Don't overthink it, and don't try to give your answer. Try to give the answer that the person can handle, not your answer. Your answer is. Yeah, but in this case, he's not a fool. He's got his own tensions in life, and he's asking a question. So okay, so the simplest answer is one that'll keep you on track to say what you want to say, and be able, and that's like a politician's mind in a certain sense. That's what politicians do. So they have this persona that they put on when they speak to people, and that persona is not necessarily how they think. It could be completely different. It's just that this is how you handle mass media. This is the only way. You can't do it any other way. If there would be someone who was able to do both, that would be like a very capable person. But most people can't do both. You can't. You're either this or that. And so we have these empty, hollow politicians whose only claim to being a leader is that they can think. They don't think on their feet when they're talking. They are good at regurgitating what they were told to say.
Yeah, they know the line.
They know the line.
So there is a connection.
And by the way, it's the same thing in chess. It's very interesting. Chess is also the same way. There are lines. People don't realize this, but in chess, I mean, I'm sure people realize to some extent, but they don't know how far this reaches. In chess, the greatest chess players have lines of, could be a dozen, 2 dozen even, moves memorized. And they have hundreds of these, if not thousands of them, memorized. And even if you make a little deviation, they know how to bring it back to the line that they want. And so they've got this thing, this is the line, this is what you're supposed to stick to. So that's a different type of thinking than the type of thinking that we do when we're sitting and thinking about something. It's a completely different problem. And when we sit and think with ourselves, it's a completely different part of, it's a different persona altogether. Everything is so what Kabbalah is very sensitive to is to these different personas that we take on in life in different situations, because a person is very complex. Now, if you take a very simple person who doesn't have time to think, who doesn't have time to speak, doesn't have time or anything, all he's busy with all day long is making a living and he's plowing a field or whatever, so these things don't get developed. But the more developed the person is, the more these personas become separate from one another, and you need these influences between them. Okay.
What you're really saying, in a sense, is our speech is really subtext that, no, okay.
So the statement that you said before about Altan Ksil Kivalto, so he says this almost the same way, but again in the positive sense. Kedei she'az yuchal hamkabel kata erich lekabel. Without this detour, without this ability of the mind of Zat to influence the speech or the persona of Nukva, without these hair follicles creating this short or this alternate conduit for the mind, then things that are smaller would not be able to receive light because they don't have the vessel for something greater. So there has to be some kind of contraction that also happens, meaning that it's not just a different mindset, as it were. It's also a contracted mindset. Like we said, it's like you know beforehand what you're going to say. You don't think on your feet if you're a professional politician. You have to have all the answers already beforehand, and you have to stick to them, and you can't move. And that's how this thing works. In any case, let's continue. ומזל נוקבה, שהם קרובים בערך, תקבל השפע מגופו דזה, שהם מבחינת נהי שבו. But normally, from Za to Nukva, from the small continents to the feminine persona, it will, because they're very close to one another, in fact, they're back to back, or front to back, but from the chest and down. So because of that, she will receive directly from his Nehi, directly from his three lower habitual sfirot, shehem מעצמיותו כמו חיות הנפש שבאיברים. And that's like a transfusion. It's like you're connecting two people, and they're physically like Adam and Eve were together before they were separated. This whole thing that Adam and Eve were together and then they were separated, in Kabbalah is like taken as a description that is time dependent. There are times during the day or times in history when Adam and Eve are separated, when the male and the female, the masculine and feminine in the universe are separated enough so that they can turn around and face one another. But most of the time, they're actually stuck back to back. Again, so the Kabbalah will take the story in the Torah and completely abstract it and say, this is not talking about Adam and Eve per se, this is talking about the relationship between the masculine and feminine inside of me. And there are times when it's severed and times when they're together. So you have, in the whole cycle of the year, the first 10 days of the year, they're called the Nesirah, they're called the severing. So the first 10 days, the first 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, all the way to Yom Kippur, it's called the time of severing of Adam from Eve in the world. It's not each one of us personally. It's in the world itself. It's in the universe. And then they turn around, and finally on Simchas Torah they come together. Shmini Atzeres, they come together face to face. They copulate, and then there's something born that year from that. So that exists on a temporal level of the entire year. During the cycle of prayers every day, we also go through this mini severance and coming together again. All these things happen every day. So that's the way that Kabbalah will abstract all these events in the Bible. Va'inyan, and now he's going to say this. Va'inyan ki hamalchut hu b'chinat dvar Hashem v'ruach piv hamchaya nivreim me'ayin leyesh. Because as we said, malchus, meaning the nukva, the feminine, is the word of God, the breath of His mouth, as a word that gives life to everything from nothingness, meaning from not existing to existing. Umuchin de nukva nimshachim menehi deza haynu b'chinat ha'chokhmah shebadibur ech u'ma le'ashpia. And normally, the speech gets its influence from the habits of Zah. That's what we said before. That usually the person just repeats what he's used to repeating, what he's used to saying. He gives the same answer. So he has to practice. He has to go through some preparation to know what he wants to say. That's the usual influence. But sometimes, like here, אבל מה שנמשך ממוחין דאבא ואמא בנוקבה הם למד בית נתיבות החוכמה שבתורה. But here what we have is something entirely different, and here it's higher. It comes directly from the mind. So this is not, again, we said there are two types of things that we say. There are the things that we say out of habit. That is when Zah normally influences Nukva through the habitual sfirot, through the Nehi. That's the normal conduit. That's the way we usually act. And then he says that there's a speech of Torah when you're speaking words of Torah. So that's coming through the hair follicles directly from Abba and Ima, directly from the mind of Zah, not from his habits. And so Torah is always a chiddush. Torah always, when you speak Torah, it influences you to say something new. It's like it's almost built in. Because the mind is not the usual mind. The usual mind for Nukva is coming from Zah's habits. The habits become the mind. Remember, we said this about children. That what I do, my children understand as the basis of their thought. They look at what I do. They look at my habits. That becomes the basis of their thought. They don't understand what's behind my actions. They don't understand my mindset. They don't get it from my actions. All they get is the actions. But here in Torah, this is what we're talking about, that there's a hair follicle, the hair follicle is coming down, and they're taking the mind of Zah, the Abba and Ima, the Chokhmah and Bina, the wisdom and understanding of Zah, and bringing it directly down to Nukva. And so that happens when a person is speaking Torah. So when he's speaking Torah, it's not habit. It's not, although there also is that. There's also habit in Torah. For instance, people learn Torah by heart, right? But even then, we see that if you're very diligent about learning something by heart, it begins to speak within you with new words, with new understanding. The famous example is the Beis Yosef, and the Beis Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, he used to memorize Mishnah. He did this for many, many, many years, and I think it was towards the age of 60. After he always had a custom that on Friday night after the meal, he'd go back to the shul and he'd start reciting Mishnah, and he'd finish most of the Mishnah every Friday night. And about when he was 60, the Mishnah began to speak in him. That's what he calls it. That after 50 or so years of reciting it and knowing it, so he began to have a magid in the Mishnah. The Mishnah began to speak Torah. And he wrote a whole book from this called Magid Mesharim. And it's full of beautiful, beautiful things. And again, it's just from recitation. He's not trying to say anything new, but because it's connecting this way apparently to the mind of Zah in him, so it began to speak in him. It began to give, and really these are some of the most beautiful pieces of Torah ever that he spoke. And somebody listened. There was someone who used to listen because he couldn't. And somebody used to listen and write it down on Motzei Shabbos, and that's how we got this book, Magid Mesharim. All this is called the 32 pathways of wisdom in the Torah. So the 32 pathways of wisdom, to come down to Zah, they have to go through this direct route, like bypassing the usual system, and they come down directly to the speech. שחוכמת התורה היא למעלה מעלה מחוכמה זו שבדיבור, והיא בחינת חוכמה עילה, ושורשה בחוכמה דאק, שלכן נקרא משל הקדמוני. And so this all has to do with the fact that all the wisdoms are connected one to another, a little bit like we discussed about the circles being all, if you know one circle, you've touched them all. Same idea with wisdoms, that the wisdom of the Torah in the end comes from the highest element of wisdom. By the way, it's always in Kabbalah, the Torah is not the highest element of wisdom. There's much higher than that. But the way it came down, it's called Mashal HaKadmoni, the primordial metaphor. Okay. V'nitbe'er le'ayil, and we explained earlier, if you remember, on the previous page, on page 30 at the beginning, b'inyan 50 alafim yovlot, ech sheyesh ilui achar ilui b'asagat ein sof baruch hu. How there is an ascent called 50,000 jubilees. Remember, when we discussed that there's an ascent of 50,000, there's a descent of the sabbatical years, two different systems of ascent and descent. V'shorosh kol ha'aliyot hu ad b'chinat chokhmah de'ak. And in the end, these are all described as like levels of the Garden of Eden, of understanding Torah more and more and more and more. Like deeper and deeper understanding. Until eventually, he says, you reach all the way up to what we call the wisdom of primordial man, of Adam Kadmon. Primordial man is a partzuf, it's a persona. It has nothing to do with Adam. It's not connected to the biblical story. It's a persona that is the first persona that God emanates. And this is called, this beginning, this first wisdom is called the beginning of the line. Now this we'll have to discuss next time, because it's a very big topic about what does it mean to emanate a line, what a ray of light. What is this ray of infinite light that comes into the, usually we say, this happened once. When God created the world, He created a void, and into that void He brought the infinite, the light of the infinite in. So all that's very nice and good, but the truth is that we do this all the time. We create a void inside of ourselves, and then there's a ray of infinite light that comes in. So we'll have to discuss this. I'll just give one example so that you don't go away without anything. Any person who invents a new procedure in medicine is inventing a new line. He's bringing a new ray of light into reality. Any type of invention, which is real invention, not just taking stuff that already exists and improving it. But and this especially happens when a person needs to refine themselves. They need to change everything about them. They say, I can't continue this way anymore. I have to start anew. I have to start fresh. What do you start fresh? In Kabbalah, the explanation is you start a new line. It's like a new line of life. It's like you're starting a whole new path in the world. So every day you can start one of these lines. You can start something new. So he's going to talk more about that next time.